In this video I'm going to demonstrate the UV Snapshot feature in the UV texture editor within Maya. So what we're going to do in this video is export a simple UV layout of a cube and paint a texture within Photoshop and reapply it to our cube. Right, the first thing we can do is create our cube from our shelf, and I'm going to scale this up and go into a textured mode by pressing 5 on my keyboard. And let's immediately go within the UV texture editor and export out our UV layout. You can open up the UV texture editor by going to Window, down to UV texture editor. Alternatively, you can go to Edit UVs in your polygons menu set, down to UV texture editor from here. So I'm going to click UV texture editor, and if I select my cube within my scene, we can see that our UV layout has already been created. If you don't understand UV layouts, it's basically our cube being flattened out and unfolded so we can apply texture to it. To export the UV layout, we go to the Subdivs menu within our UV texture editor and down to UV Snapshot. This will open up a new window. We firstly can specify a location to save this image, plus its name, which is going to be called OutUV. I'm saving it in my images folder in this project. The size is 512 by 512 pixels. The aspect ratio is ticked, so it conforms to squared pixels in this case. Make sure that your size corresponds to a power of 2, so make it 1024 by 1024 or 256 by 256 if you want a smaller image. In this case I'm going to keep it 512 by 512. Below the size we have a color value. The color of our layout in this case is a teal color. I'm just going to click this to demonstrate that you can change the color. Let's change it to a bright red, for example, and click accept. And we can also have the option to anti-alias the lines, in other words make it look a bit more smoother in our image editing application. Finally, we have an image format. This is going to be exported to a PNG, and again the UV range options we can leave default, normal 0 to 1, which is 0 to 1 in our UV texture space. Let's click OK, and when I click OK the image was exported and saved into our images folder. I can demonstrate this by going into my source images, and I'm going to move up a level and go into my images folder, and here we can see our UV layout. The next step is to bring this image into Photoshop so we can paint a texture corresponding to our UV coordinates. So I'm going to minimize my images folder, go into Photoshop, and I'm immediately going to maximize Photoshop to begin with. Go to File, Open, and here I'm just going to go up a level into my images folder and bring in my PNG. But Photoshop is having a bit of difficulty recognizing this image, so let's cancel out, go into my images folder and just drag out our PNG from here. Alright, very good. The next thing I'm going to do is bring in some images I want to use so I can use it in this particular texture. What do I mean by that? If I go back into my images folder and go up a level into my source images, I've got some textures that I want to use on this cube. We're going to use a brick texture, a gorilla texture, very cool, a splatter texture, a duct, plus a marble as well. And I've put all these images into a PSD file which are automatically resized for me. So I'm going to double click on this, and I'm just going to tear it off of our main menu so we can import them correctly. So with my textures document open, I'm going to select all the layers by holding down shift and selecting all of my layers like so, and drag them into my UV layout PNG like so. From here I'm just going to dock it back onto my interface and close out my textures document, and from here we can start lining up these textures for our cube. So on the top face of our cube I'm going to put the brick texture. I'm just going to do that and select the brick in my layers and drag it over the first cube like so. On the second face of my cube I want my duct, so I'm going to select my duct layer and drag it below the brick wall. Moving on, I want my gorilla texture below my metal duct, so let's select gorilla and drag it below like so. And again let's move our splatter down below that. I'm just going to turn on auto select and show transform controls, and I'm just going to drag the marble next to my splatter. And this leaves one face that we can automatically paint on, so I'm going to select my rectangle tool, fill color of a red for example, and just drag over a rectangle on my face. I'm going to press B to enable the brush tool, and let's change the brush to, let's say, a light grey, and just draw a smiley face on there to demonstrate that we can paint textures directly on our cube. So once you've painted your texture for your UV layout, we now need to save this. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and save it in my Source Images folder in my project directory. And I'm going to save this as a bitmap image and call it My Awesome Texture. In a bigger project you can name your textures accordingly. So let's save this out by clicking Save. OK, keep the default settings as they are, and I'm going to go back into Maya so we can apply this texture. Alright, let's open up the hypershade so we can create the material. In this case I'm going to create a Lambert as we don't want any specularity on our dice. Scroll down and we also need a file node so we can browse to our file and apply our texture. So once you've dragged out a file and a Lambert, I'm just going to middle click, drag and drop onto my material and plug it into colour. Double click on my file node and now I'm just going to browse to my texture, which is my awesome texture in the source images directory. So double click on that, and in the image name now corresponds to our texture. Let's exit out of that, and I'm just going to middle mouse drag onto my mesh in my scene, hit 6 to go into a textured view, close out my hypershade, and if I select my texture now, you can see that my texture corresponds to the UV layout. And that's the benefit of using UV Snapshot, importing it into Photoshop and exporting it into a separate image file, enabling you to paint textures accurately. If I just move around in this viewport, you can see that all of my images line up correctly and the grid is on top, which is pretty cool. And that is a simple process of exporting your UV layouts, editing it in Photoshop and bringing it back into Maya with the applied texture.